Council, Monday, July 9th, 2018. If you have a cell phone, please place it on silent. I call this meeting to order, and I'd ask Clerk Domingo to call the roll.
Councilmember Barnes.
Here.
Reed.
Here.
Brown.
Here.
Lawler.
Here.
Spicer. Here. French. And Mayor Brown.
Here. There are two items for individual discussion this evening. One is rental certification, and we'll begin with that. Director Tracy.
John Tracy, Director of Planning, Building, and Code Enforcement for the City of Albion. A couple of years ago, I was asked to basically write and come up with a rental certification ordinance, which we've had a draft of for 2 years now. And that was asked by the city manager at the time, with my understanding that the council would like to see rental certification. In your packets, you have a copy of the ordinance. For the most part, there's only about 4 pages that are actually in the ordinance by the city, and then it references the 2015 Property Maintenance Code. The reason for the ordinance, of course, is to have a minimum standard of health and safety for the occupants that are renting, and also the surrounding properties, that there's not a problem with blight, fire, safety, what the living conditions are inside the building, that we don't have a problem with sanitation or peeling paint. That affects especially young children when when it's found to have lead-based paint in it. Electrical hazards, which we run across periodically. Not saying that every rental property is that way. We have a lot of very good rental properties in town, but we do have some that have problems. On average, usually get about 25 to 45 calls a year to go into rental properties that we have problems in, that stem anywhere from sewage backup to electrical to insufficient ventilation or light within inside of it, or structure failures. So the ordinance that you have there, if you look down through, and just to give you kind of a brief overview, it also, in what was written by the city's portion of it here, has some protection for the property owner too, rather than everything being just on everything falling against the property owner. It gives some responsibilities to the occupants for keeping the sanitation of the rental unit up, making sure that mold and mildew doesn't become a problem because of them not keeping areas clean and or dry around showers and or sinks, not allowing for the creation of allowing for cockroaches to be brought in, and or other bed bugs and things of that nature. Of course, when they first go onto a structure, it's supposed to be clear of any type of rodents and or insects, but if they allow it to occur, under this ordinance, it's their responsibility to take care of it. So, or any other safety or health issues that are created by the occupants, rather than just always putting emphasis on the property owner. So it is, there's some protection there for the property owners, and that's where you typically don't have it in others. The 2015 Property Maintenance Code that's referenced here was adopted in 2016 by the city of Albion. It is something that we're already using, and it would be the same ordinance that would be used for rental certification. So this is an ordinance that's been in place since 2016. Actually, prior to that, it's just a difference of every 3 years. The ordinance has changed a little bit, and we re-adopt them. So. 'It's not something that's just for rental certification. that's referenced. It is straight across the board, whether it's rental, owner-occupied, commercial buildings, and such. It could be for, I mean, it also applies to stores, factories, and such too. So it's not something that we're bringing on board in reference to out of this just for rental properties. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of what the ordinance is about.
So, I've mentioned this in other settings too. This applies to the dorms.
Correct. This is straight across the board.
Yeah.
No, in this ordinance, the way it's written, it does not have any exceptions for anyone. It's across the board, whether it's ABA property that has rentals that are, for example, like Maple Grove, the dorms at the college, or any other rental properties, whether it's a single house or multiple apartments in a building.
Okay.
And
So,
whoever it's owned by.
So I guess another question I had, so I know like different communities do different things in terms of the frequency of inspections.
Correct.
And then I've also heard of instances where I guess the most critical aspects of the inspections are rolled out first, and then you gradually increase. Does this? Can you describe what the draft is proposing in terms of the frequency, and then
Sure.
will it? You know, will be? Is there a way to have it where it would only start at a certain, key components?
Primarily, the way it's written to begin with is registration would be the first phase of it. It would probably take a year to go through and make sure everything's registered. There would be an annual registration, and there's a few different reasons for that, because properties quite often will change ownership and or go into an LLC, and sometimes they're changed from one hand to another with another LLC being created. This way it gives us some tracking on being able to know who actually is responsible for it, rather than just off of a real estate summary sheet that's not always up to date, because it is whoever that property owner's information is in, it's their responsibility to report that. It doesn't always happen right away. So if it's someone that lives in the city who has rentals, whether it's a single individual or if it's an LLC in state or an LLC out of state, we have rentals that are owned by individuals who live outside the city of Albion, and we have them who live outside the city of, or outside the state of Michigan. So it varies quite a bit. And we have some that only have one rental, and we have some that own 40 rental properties or so. So it's important to have a registration so you know who actually is in control of the properties, and if the owner that's shown of record has an agent who's actually supposed to be taking care of the properties and the correct addresses for the information to go to. As far as the certifications, they would probably come in the following year for inspection. And that primarily, of course, you're going to have, you'd have your major items. When an inspection would be performed, primarily the major items would need to be taken care of first, and then, not saying that everything would not be inspected, but the timelines would be extended out for the more, for the less hazardous items that may need to be taken care of. And we're not looking at, we're not looking at saying you've got to go ahead and have a certain color of paint. We're not saying that you have to, have your siding has to be flawless without any, any type of cracks in a vinyl sign or things of that nature. We're looking at the basic, bare necessity, safety, health and safety. And that's what the state code's written off of, and that's also what the International Property Maintenance Code is. It's the bare safety for the individuals. So if there's something that's not a major violation, for example, carbon monoxide, it's evident that there's carbon monoxide or the possibility where someone's incorrectly vented a gas furnace or especially water heaters now, since so many people are going to high efficiency furnaces. You still have gas water heaters out there and furnaces that are older. We run across in times that are vented 3 times or 4 times further across the room than allowed by the manufacturer specs alone, let alone under the code. So I've been in a number of places years back before we were involved heavily in following up on complaints where we'd get called in, people would be sick from actual carbon monoxide where they thought they had the flu or were extremely tired or things of that nature and wind up in the hospital. So
I do have one question. So basically, I know the first part of what we were given in the packet that has draft on it, and then there's like a second section that has, I guess it's
the reference codes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
from the International Property Maintenance Code.
Right.
So is all of that being incorporated into by reference?
By reference.
Okay.
The one thing you need to realize, and you probably already see that, is the copies you have, there's more in writing and print there than what you typically run across the code, because that is a commentary. So if you look at, for example, and I'll just show you a brief example. Under demolition, for example, there's a section here, which wouldn't be, of course, for the rental, but it's a brief paragraph. Under the commentary, you wind up having you have the brief amount, and then you have 2 sentences or 2 paragraphs of commentary to it. So what you have there is looks like a lot more than what there really is. Okay, so and the reason I put the commentary in there is so as you're going through them, you have more of an idea of why those codes were written. Codes, of course, whether they be building, mechanical, plumbing, or electrical, are all based on case history and actual things that I've had. So,
Councilmember French.
So as I was reading through this, everywhere I saw that diamond-shaped character, that's commentary.
that's commentary, correct? Yes.
But there's section of that. So, for example, as one of the things I was reading through in the commentary, there was like, for example, address identification. Right now, it's
Right.
pretty specific there about, numbers shall not be spelled out.
Correct.
But I don't think we adopted. Yeah, we didn't adopt that, did we? Because
Well, actually, in some areas, let me back up. The reason numbers shall not be spelled out is because of first responders primarily.
Okay.
It's important that you have addresses on all, not only on the buildings, but addresses on the apartments, and that they're easily spotted. When it comes to writing, I think all of us can say we've seen some writing that's not necessarily easiest to read, especially at first glance.
Okay.
Where when you have a 4-inch letter with a 1/2-inch stroke on it, minimum, that stands out more. That's easy to see.
Okay.
So if you have a fireman or an ambulance looking for an address, it's a lot easier for them to see that than it is trying to read letters
Okay.
spelled out, and that's why that's in there. We also have that under city ordinance too. So
Now, is that even for residences that won't be
that's
controlled by?
actually right across the board. Yes.
Okay. So the work of enforcing this obviously is going to fall on, I shouldn't say obviously, but it's going to fall on Safe Build, or is it going to fall on in-house staff?
Well, to be honest with you, in the reality of it all, to tell you that we should go ahead and hire a full-time person additional to do this would be costly to the city. And I mean, it's up to the council if we go through with this, but most cities that have rental certification, for example, Coldwater, Three Rivers, who has over 1,000 rental properties. They actually taken contracted out to, and in this case, it happens to be Safe Built. There's other cities that that size that contract out with others. Reason being, it's not, you don't have all the cost of a full-time person when you have 1,000 or 900 or 800 apartments and you're inspecting them maybe biannually or every 3 years. It works out a lot cheaper for the taxpayers because the money that's being paid is directly for that inspection and inspector rather than paying for somebody's health and retirement fund and such.
Okay.
The paperwork for the most part would most likely wind up being through the office in-house.
Okay. So as it stands right now, this would be an annual, we wouldn't do like biannual?
The registration would be annual.
Okay.
The certification would be up to council's discretion. It could be annually. I put in there biannually,
Okay.
just as, but it could be annually, biannually, or every 3 years. I mean, if you wanted to put in there, for example, say we had it, say it was annually, and what some areas will do, if the apartment passes without any violations, they may wind up skipping a year since they didn't have any problems in it. Or 2 years.
Councilmember Spicer.
Thank you, Mayor. John, you indicated that the certification registration has been in place since 2016?
The International Property Maintenance Code that we're currently under was adopted in 2016 by the city. So that portion of this code that the majority of it's referenced is already in place. It's just that we don't have a specific rental certification program.
So then we are not, what are we doing?
Right now, we go into apartments that we have complaints on. An occupant's living in there. Sometimes they get called by CPS or DHS, Child Protective Services, or by Adult Protective Services. Most of the time, the cases are, though, where we get called by an occupant that has a problem where you have electrical problems, or it might be, as I was talking about earlier, they're not feeling great, and it winds up being a actual venting problem with a gas-fired appliance, a furnace, or a water heater. It could be, in some cases, for example, one of the buildings where the floor was becoming very soft, and what had happened, when you walk across it would actually move, and they had a termite at some time point. They had a termite infestation, and that was taken care of, but whoever owned the building never had the beams underneath replaced, so it was a hazard, basically to the point where the floor could give way when somebody's walking on it. So.
Okay, thank you. So then if this rental registration certification were to become an ordinance, or to become reality, would we then handle it the same way we do now? Wait until we get complaints, or how do you?
The difference would be any rental properties, and there again, whether it's a single house that's being rented, or multiple apartments, or a dormitory, it would be required either annually or biannually, whatever the council would prefer to go with. And like I say, in the draft, it's in there for every 2 years. For that to be inspected to make sure that it meets the minimum requirements. So they would be required within 30 days of the expiration of the prior, not any farther out than that, but within 30 days of the time that it expired, to be re-inspected to make sure it still meets minimum safety requirements.
So with a in your opinion, full-time employee, we could keep up with the rental certification for a 2-year period so that every
Well, and
property is
that's,
certified?
that's why I was saying that I wouldn't necessarily say that would be in the city's best interest to hire someone full-time just to do those inspections. You'd probably want to go ahead and go with a contract with one of the, like Safe Built, or if you prefer someone else, to do those, because that way you don't have the extra additional costs coming into the taxpayer. The cost of the permits would be whatever it costs to have the inspectors go out, and if there's anything tacked on top of that would be for maybe some paperwork. But in most cases, you're cutting your costs down to the taxpayers, and that they actually don't own the properties. That's placed more on the property owners.
So one question I have, and like I said, I've been kind of reading back through this. So in the non-certification year, when it's just, just you're doing your basically almost like a census of rental properties basically annually, is there a fee associated with just that, or is the fee only going to be associated with the certification?
Right now, if we're called in, we're not charging the individual who's calling us in, the occupant, and we're not charging the property owner. Okay. So any cost that's occurred, whether I go in or if I have one of the inspectors go in, especially where things have been quite often, we use the inspectors to go in. There's just not enough time at this point. We're spending the taxpayers' money for that to go in. But any follow-up inspections that are done that come out of that, whether it's violations that can be corrected by, say, the property owner, the re-inspection fee they have to pay for, or if there's electrical or mechanical, those inspections, if it's electrical or mechanical to begin with, if it's a rental property, it has to be taken care of, whether you have rental certification or not. It has to be taken care of by a licensed individual in that field to make sure it's done properly, and then re-inspected. So those costs are passed on to the property owner.
Okay, but so that's if you receive a call, but like it's under this, if I'm a landlord,
the landlord, the property owner, whether it's a single individual or LLC, would be responsible for paying the certification costs.
But that's when you say certification, that's when we actually go through that 1 year and check.
Yeah.
But in the off year, let's say we do the biannually, then they don't have to pay or something.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Councilmember
Other than just the registration fees, which would be suggested yearly, just to make sure they're registered under the correct names. But the actual inspections, no.
Okay. Councilmember Lawler.
Thank you, Mayor. I actually have 2 questions. My first one is, you said Safe Built, the outside service. Do they do any surrounding area around Albion?
Right now, I know they do 3 Rivers. They've had a program over there for probably about 5 years now. I know they've had a couple other areas. I'm not sure who else. Currently, there's one looking at them too. But they've been involved, and I've had conversations with 3 Rivers over there on them to see what their performance has been like. And actually, I've gone over to 3 Rivers a couple years ago. At the time, I originally did the ordinance here to see how they run, and because like I say, they have right around 1,000 apartments in 3 Rivers, and to see what type of effect it's had there, and they've done quite well.
And my second question is, have we talked to the landlord association in Albion?
We've talked to them previously, yeah. Unfortunately,
how they feel about it?
Unfortunately, with me, yeah, definitely have. And I know there's a few things they would like to see different. I know Section 8 was brought up, using a Section 8 inspection, which is lesser of an inspection. The problem I have with that, if we're under state minimums, and we've already adopted the 2015 International Property Maintenance Code, it's my opinion that you're two different things. You're going with a lesser requirement for health and safety, and also I believe you, and I could be wrong, but the city attorney would want to correct me if we didn't go with what's required by state minimum. It could open us up for liability.
Thank you.
So the additional question I have is for that fee in the year that there's not an actual certification, like run-through check.
Mm-hmm.
How do we keep that fee from being arbitrary? Do other cities do it? What does it usually look like?
Typically, most cities that are doing it, they charge a smaller fee, usually around $25 for the paperwork. And that's, some cities charge it per apartment. I don't see why we would need to charge that registration for each exact apartment. If there's 40 apartments on one parcel, I would say unless we wound up coming across where it costs us more than that, to maybe adjust. But in my opinion, I would charge per parcel.
Okay.
Because they'll still need to put all the information in there, but at least you have the paperwork just under one parcel numbered and one main address.
Okay. And so are they filling out the paperwork, or we're filling out the paperwork?
They would be responsible for filling out the paperwork.
Okay. Councilmember Spicer.
Thank you. John, a scenario. Say there is a duplex and in one unit lives the mother and the other unit lives the daughter, and it's paid for and neither one pays rent to each other. How would a situation like that be handled? Does it still need to be certified as a rental unit?
If it depending on,
it's owned by the mother.
If it's owned by the mother and it's not being rented, that is different than being, I mean, if it were to, and if you look in the ordinance, there's different descriptions, definitions of family. Okay. Under a single family, you have so many individuals. Even though you could have a couple siblings, or maybe 3 siblings, or a grandfather living in the structure and having a separate room and things of that nature, and that's considered under the single family. When it becomes where it's being rented out, it doesn't fit the definition of family anymore. That's when you have your own certification falling into place.
Thank you.
So, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating what you said, but so I think, let's say you had you had parents who were in their 70s or something, and they have a 40-year-old kid and other.
And if you look in here, when you look under that, there's a definition of a single family, and then there's definition, actually, let's see here. No, there's got a couple definitions. Well, can't find it right quickly offhand, but anyway, if you're looking at where it's blood relation or there's a few other cases where if it's in-laws, things of that nature, it still fall.
And I guess another question, I know there was some, I don't know if it was passed or just proposed, but there were some things about when you have these temporary rentals, I'm sorry.
B&Bs, Airbnbs,
yeah.
That's a total different game in itself, ball game.
Okay.
That's something that has been brought up. Right now we have a bed and breakfast permit system, and Airbnbs are, that's something the council may want us to look at. I know we've had complaints on them, but that's a little bit different than your typical rental property.
Okay. Councilmember Reed.
I'm looking at section 308 5.1, accumulation of garbage and rubbish. Who's responsible for that? The land, the owner of
Well,
the property, or
Okay,
the?
certain parts, to begin with, certain parts of this, if you look at the beginning, I'll have exceptions, where certain parts are covered under our own ordinance. Bottom line, rubbish, the pickup of rubbish, whether it be single family or if you have 30 families in a rental complex, the primary responsibility of that is under the property owner. The part where it would not be under property owner, under this ordinance, would be when the occupant is creating a problem, putting trash outside, not taking it to the dumpster, or in a tipper is supposed to be in creating a hazard inside with garbage.
Like old furniture,
Old furniture, and there's even a section in here that addresses items that are used for indoor, that wind up outdoors being used, that it basically considers it a violation, so you don't have couches and that outside that are not designed for outside. It's primarily what happens with actually, there's a few different things. You have sometimes fleas that wind up infesting them. If you have animals out there that are laying on them, mice, rats, raccoons, possums, they all like furniture. Ticks that are, you have animals and ticks rub off on the furniture outside. You have moisture, you wind up with furniture rotting outside, things of that nature. So there's a number of things that's created by hazards. It's just like tires sitting outside that have no rims on them, and they get water in them. You have a mosquito problem. So, but yes, that would be, you know, if you have under this, if you have a tenant that's creating a problem that way, then the tenant would be approached on it. If it's something that the landlord had done, then that's a different story. But we've had both.
I think this is basically the tenant does it and the landlord doesn't say anything because it's just getting piled higher and deeper. And
right.
So that would be taken care of under this.
Correct.
Yes.
Um, so, for example, like one of the things that, you know, because you hear both sides about rental certifications. Mm-hmm. So, like, for example, like the screen door, that's one of the things. So in here, I know in the, well, that's not the commentary, but there's a from date to date thing. Is that something we're gonna have to set, or is there like a standard?
That's basically, we have that currently in ours as it is.
Okay.
From starting date through winter date, that screens have to be maintained.
Okay.
And that is so that there's good ventilation to whether it's, and in that case, whether it's an apartment or any type of dwelling, so that mosquitoes and things of that nature don't get into the house when you have your windows open, especially in weather that we've had lately.
Okay. So would there be, I guess, because we've never done this before and this is new, would there be a set window of time that we would do this? Because, you know, certain things might be apparent during certain seasons and versus others. Would it be unannounced? Would the landlord know when we're coming? Like,
as far as for the actual
inspection.
The landlord would definitely, when the rental certification would need to be done, they would definitely know when.
Okay. And
they would have to arrange for it to be done too. So
okay.
They would definitely know when it would be and what time it would be.
Okay. And then the other thing, you know, I talked to a landlord, maybe around 2016 when I was out walking, and we've had this conversation before or mentioned it. So sometimes you'd have tenants, and it was kind of brought up earlier too, you have a tenant who runs up a water bill and then leaves. Or, does certain thing that might do certain property. I mean, is there any way to help, or is that a different vehicle that we could?
Water bills, well, let me use an example to a water bill in something that utility companies typically do, not only in Michigan, but around the country. Electric bills, gas bills, typically when they're in somebody's name, when they move, that follows them. That's not left with the, necessarily with the property owner, okay? So when they go to have something turned on somewhere else, that person's still responsible. They typically, a power company in a lot of cases will not turn on power. Water bills is a different thing. That is a city utility, and if something was to be done with that differently, that would be, and I'm not sure how far that could go with.
Attorney Harkness.
So I was going to say, we actually have an ordinance in the city where landlords can transfer the responsibility of water bills to the tenant to preclude, for example, water leaning from being on the property if somebody fails to pay the bill. We don't have anybody in the city that's taken the steps to comply with the ordinance, but we do have the ordinance in place to address that issue.
Okay. Is there a comment from council? Okay. So, I know we're not voting. In all honesty, what I see here, I think this is a necessary thing because we want to make sure that we're providing for the safety of residents. I mean, rentals make up a large amount of
It's the exact number. The exact number of rentals is not totally known. For years, it's been estimated between 35 to 40%. It's probably not quite that high now, but it's as far as 40%. But I'd say it's probably still up around 32%.
Okay.
3%.
So, I guess the other question I have is, what if someone does start renting something out but does not register? How are you going to know that that's happened?
Well, to begin with, if it's as you go along in your research, and we found out about a lot of properties over the years by a number of different things where people have, for example, more than one place homesteaded. Have 4 or 5, and you know that they're not all living at the same place. You have sometimes the water billing that indicates different, and then some of it's word of mouth. And then of course there's times that people, if they're not able to do something, they let you know when somebody else is doing something wrong. So some of it's by word of mouth, some of it's by research, some of it's just by pure running across it. But undoubtedly it'd probably take a period of time to make sure that everything was covered, but I would almost, I won't say bet, but I think you'd be surprised how many would wind up turning up. Because bottom line, if they didn't register and it was found out, they would be fined, and it would be posted on FIT until it was certified.
And then an additional question. So I'm just curious. So we have the single hauler system. There's a garbage facilities language there.
That, if you look in the first part, that's one of those that is excluded out of there.
Okay. Yeah.
Because that's covered under Chapter 60.
Okay.
67.
Are there any other questions this evening from council on? So, if there was no objections from councils, would we be prepared for a first reading on our next meeting, or what would the time? Would we have to? I guess I'm saying, like, would we have to decide or extend any contract with safe
The
build?
biggest thing is you would need to determine on one that, do you want to contract it out?
Okay.
And another part of it, I would say, would be a good thing to know is what you want to do as far as annually, biannually. Do you want to put some other language in there?
Okay, Attorney Hartness.
So there's a couple of blanks in the ordinance that the
Yeah.
council's gonna have to fill in, so I guess my suggestion would be two things. One, put it on maybe for discussion at your next meeting so that you can kind of reflect on what you presented tonight, and then, I mean, between myself and Director Tracy, we can probably help the council fill in those blanks. The other thing you might want to consider is, if you're gonna look at contracting out for some of these rental certification services, I think the simplest solution to that would be you can go ahead and move forward with the ordinance, but just put the effective date further down the road so that it'll be in place, but it won't take effect until later in the year, and that'll be the time
Yeah.
to explore whether or not you want to have an outside contractor take care of that.
Councilmember Spicer.
Thank you. Director Tracy, do you have any idea what some contracted obligation like this would run approximately, if any?
Right now, in some areas, I believe the cost, and it depends on how it's structured and who does paperwork or not. Bare bones, you're looking, I think, on one of them that's $54 an inspection to charge for the actual inspection firm to come in, and then anything that's they find that's written up, they do the actual write-ups and such. There again, if you had any costs, if there's any paperwork that's done in-house, you might want to put a percentage on there, just like with others, maybe 5%, 10%, whatever, if there's extra paperwork. I'm not saying that there would be, depending on who you have doing it. But right now, I know one of them is $54 per inspection, and unless there's additional inspections that have to be done, follow-up, that's what it costs. Whether it's straight to the individual or to the city that's doing it, that's their flat rate.
Councilmember French.
Back of the envelope calculation at 3,100 properties in the city of Albion, 5% of my rental properties leaves 1,085 properties at $4 each, is $58,590. That's kind of the ballpark we're in, about 50,000, 55, 60,000.
But just for clarification, we're not paying for the inspections.
No.
That's what rental property owners collectively in the city be paying for
Every 2 years.
every 2 years.
Yeah, and I guess the other, because basically, if there are no violations and I'm a landlord in the non-inspection year, just to register, my registration is going to be, let's say, we could say roughly, let's say 20, we set that, but let's say it's $25. Okay. The next year when you're inspected, that would be 50. Could be.
You would still have the rental registration each
Okay.
year besides that.
Okay.
Now, whether it's 25 or if it's less, depending on the cost.
Okay.
I don't think you want to reflect it onto the taxpayers as a whole.
So two questions. So I guess two additional questions. One is, what's the time frame? I guess are the time frames going to differ depending on the magnitude of the issue? That's one. And then two, if a landlord wanted to appeal something, what's the process for?
Through the Building Board of Appeals. It's in the ordinance too.
Okay.
It refers to if they feel that their inspector is unjustly saying something needs to be done, or anything to make sure they do have recourse to go through that. Okay. And if it doesn't, and if you're not happy with the Building Board of Appeals, they always have a time frame to go to court.
Okay. But then the first question in terms of fixing, I think that's what I think. My sense is that there are landlords who are concerned about just being hammered.
That's not the intent of the ordinance. I know there are areas that landlords feel that they are being hammered. Whether they are or not, I'm not going to go into that. Some areas have very much stricter. For example, I'll use an old one that happened to my brother years back, 30 years ago. He sold a house in a community over towards the Detroit Dearborn area. He lived in it for 20-some years, had a crushed limestone driveway, perfect driveway. Before he could sell it, it had to be paved or concrete. That was in their ordinance. So was it required by state? No. Some areas require more in-depth inspection and more than others. This is the bare bones, what's required by state. Some cities will have more to it. They can add, they can't, they basically can't go less.
Okay.
They can always add to it, which is not the intent of this.
Okay. So I'm not hearing, is there any further discussion from council? Councilmember Lawler.
Thank you, Mayor. So in talking with the Albion Landlord Association, did we take some of their ideas into consideration?
Oh, definitely so. Well, it's just like, whether it's 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. Originally, we were looking at every year. What we did not go with was the Section 8, and the reason being is, as I said earlier, a lesser inspection requirement under than what's already on the books and what's already adopted by the city with the 2015 International Property Maintenance Code. You're going against what you already have in place across the board, nor would it be my suggestion to go less than what the minimum state requirements would be.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Spicer.
Thank you, Mayor. With regard to possibility of adopting this ordinance, I think that some landlords certainly should be held accountable. Those landlords that are responsible and do care for their properties. I'm kind of torn because I'm thinking that some homeowners don't take good care of their property, and we don't. They're not under this obligation to get their property certified, but we're going to do that to a landlord. So I don't know. I'm just kind of torn between.
Well, if you look at currently, we run across, and unfortunately, we're kind of behind on everything right now, with everything that's been happening and lack of staff. Whether it's, bottom line, if it's a property that a house is collapsing, falling in, something's happening to it, it doesn't matter whether it's rented or not, it is addressed under the International Property Maintenance Code, under state code. Whether it is a rental or a homeowner, if we know that they are without water, they have children in there, it's addressed the same way right now. Just like as I said earlier, we've periodically called by CPS about children's welfare, and it's not necessarily a rental property. We've had it in property, homeowners that are actually the homeowners of it. So we had one house that was actually torn down here several years back because, and it was not a rental, it was owner occupied because their sewage is backed up. They literally were putting the feces in the bathtub and then taking it out in the backyard in the middle of the night. And the house was so bad it had to be torn down. We've had a few houses like that, and they were not rentals. So this is not something that just is geared. The property maintenance code that's in place right now is across the board.
So basically what you're saying is we have rules on the books for residential, single family, and then what we're doing right now is we're just trying to make a easier process for rental. Sure. But if something happens, like on one of the pages they had like a picture of a failing foundation, right? If that happens on a residential and we become aware of it,
yes,
we're going to deal with it. It's just that we have been understaffed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Councilmember Lawler.
Thank you, Mayor. There was one person that came to a meeting and that I had spoke with, and they were asking why, I guess I'm speaking to the council, why can't we go with what we have and enforce that, since you know, a lot of things that are going on with properties are not being enforced. So I guess this gentleman was asking why couldn't we go with what we have and see how that works for at least like a year or two, and if it doesn't.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say there is no current rental certificate. There's no rule in place that's specific to rentals.
Rental.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's nothing. If we become like, I think what I heard Director Tracy saying earlier is if someone lives in an apartment and they make a complaint, then the city will come in and do an inspection.
Or
Yeah.
or if it's a next door neighbor. I mean, we do have some complaints sometimes off that. Very rarely will you have anybody sign a complaint because they're afraid that there may be some retaliation on them. But we have those too. We get a lot of calls from people who live next door to rentals too. So, and or homeowner occupied too. So it's and it's council's call. One of the things that I know, and take it for what it's worth, your housing stock. If you look for people wanting to move into areas, they look at your housing stock and often it's asked what kind of codes you have. That's another factor in it. So, it's up to council.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor.
Well, I have one last question. So, kind of sparked by, because I'm trying to move us along here, but sparked by something that Councilmember Spicer said. So, for example, if we have the requirement for, let's say, like the screen doors not to have, to be functional between a certain time, is that language there for just a regular house?
It doesn't. Yeah, it's across the board.
Okay. One last
Yes.
question. Yeah.
Yes.
Councilmember Spicer.
Thank you. So, John, you don't see landlords, an influx of landlords dumping their property because of this rental certification. Do you see that it's going to help or hinder, hurt? What?
To be honest with you, my opinion is, in the almost 20 years I've been here, it doesn't matter whether it's a rental or if it's somewhere that someone's living. If they're not going to take care of it, then they're going to dump it. And I've seen both done. I've seen people let something go to the bare bones of falling in and let it go back on taxes.
Right.
I've seen that done with a number of occupied by homeowners, and I've seen it done with rentals. We've had over, 60 properties over the last number of years that would have been demoed. A lot of them used to be rentals, and there's those that weren't rentals. So you have them both ways. So in honesty and going into some of the rentals over the years, you'd be really amazed at some of the conditions. But I've been also into some properties where one had 70 cats inside, and there was a homeowner. And the house wound up being taken down. Eventually, they moved out, and you couldn't stand to go in the front door without a mask on because of the high ammonia smell from the cat urine. So, if you're going to take care of a property, you're going to take care of a property. If you don't meet the minimum, that means that usually you don't either have a furnace working, you have electrical problem, you have the chance for a fire, and I don't know how many fires you've gone to over the years because of electrical. If you have carbon monoxide poisoning, it's because something wasn't done correctly. Those are life items, or whether it's a rental or any other property. If you're not keeping it up to that bare minimum. No.
Thank you. I'm not foreseeing future at all. I wish I could. I'd be a millionaire. However, I'm wondering about landlords that will just not pass certification, retain the property for as long as they could, let it go back and become on the city's tax roll, and because of the certification. So I'm just thinking.
I'll be honest with you. Over the years, without rental certification, I've seen a lot of them go back anyway. When you bleed a property dry, you bleed a property dry, one way or the other.
Okay. Is there, seeing there's no further comments for item A, we'll move on to item B, sale of city-owned property. Attorney Harkness. Thank you, John.
Yep.
So, what you've got before you are, I pulled several samples of some of the few municipalities that do have ordinances regarding the sale of real property. You've got Leslie, Midland, Lansing, and Detroit. So basically, what the council needs to decide is what kind of procedure you want to use. You know, if you look at Leslie, and I'll just kind of touch on each of these kind of briefly. I mean, Leslie. Back.
Yeah.
The last three things.
Yeah.
Leslie has, basically, if the property is worth more than $5,000, it's a bidding process. With the city of Midland, the property is in excess of $20,000 unless the council determines otherwise. It's done in the sealed proposal, meaning the sealed bid process. City of Lansing has a somewhat more detailed process. I mean, they require that there be an appraisal ahead of time. There has to be an establishment of a just amount, not less than the fair market value. You know, there are some exceptions, but in that case, it doesn't apply to properties that are less than $50,000. Obviously, we're talking about municipalities that have far higher real estate values than what you're going to find in the city of Lansing, but in the city of Albion. But again, they use a process where they identify, you know, the value ahead of time, and then you've got Detroit that also does a sealed bidding process. In Detroit, they actually require a deposit of 10% when they do a bid. They establish in certain cases that are when the property is $2,000 or more, a minimum for the bid. And so those are just some samples. I mean, so I think there's a couple of questions that the council is going to have to decide. Is one, do you want to do a bidding process, a closed bidding process? Do you want to have a minimum that you do across the board based on if a property that could be sold exceeds a certain value, and are you going to require a deposit with a bid and things of that nature? I mean, my suggestion to council would be based upon at least the last few of these that have come to council is, I think probably a closed bid or an auction type scenario is what you're going to want. Otherwise, you're just going to have a constant back and forth with proposed buyers in an open council meeting that is just never going to end. I mean, it's going to take a lot of your time and not really accomplish a pretty simple task. So I just brought you those samples so you could see what other cities are doing. Happy to answer any questions, but I mean, largely this is a kind of opportunity for you to give me some direction on where you want to go. So the question I have, so I think the other kind of element we should add in there, or maybe consider, is so in the instances that this has come before, at least the two I can think of right now, the request has come from an adjacent property owner. So, you know, that property is set there for, you know, at least a couple decades. And so in any of these, or from any of your, I guess, exploration of this, is there any kind of language? Because I know, for example, the land bank has, and Councilmember Reed's on the board, they have a policy where, you know, if they have like a vacant lot, the adjacent homeowner can buy it for $200. I'm not opposed
and I'll say, in addition to that, so in addition to the adjacent landowner issue, I'm not opposed to the bid, because something you said at the last meeting, I believe, the bid solves the problem of the back and forth.
Correct.
So once we have it, we just have to say, well, who was the
Yeah, I mean,
highest?
so, yeah, I mean, if you have a situation where you're selling a piece of property and you get 5 bids, in that case, you go with, they're closed, you just open them, whoever's the highest bidder gets the property.
Okay. And so, and like I said, I'm just trying to think through out loud, and Councilman Burns.
I like the Detroit scenario because closed bid, and it also allows for the taking of bids. The adjacent property owner has rights, which we do have in our Albion rules, and it requires them to put money down right away. Therefore, we won't have what I've experienced here: people coming saying they want to purchase the property, they don't put the money down, they don't show back up. City work to satisfy them. For me, I think this is what we need. Thank you.
And that was to answer your other question. The only one that I found that addressed the adjacent property owner is the Detroit one, and that on page 2 basically says you can offer it to the adjacent property owner alone if it's the council waives it and it's of such a character that the only conceivable person or property owner that it would be useful to is the adjacent property owner. So I think what I envision what they're describing is you have some oddly shaped parcel that happens to be adjacent that really you couldn't build a structure on and adhere to the requirements. However, it could be valuable to the adjacent property owner, so you can waive the normal requirements and add it and sell it to them. I can tell you I've looked at probably about 50 different cities, and that's the only one that I saw that had that.
So, I guess the other part, I think it was the section, the second section, 14-8-5. I know, like, so for example, so in preparation for the last request, I called the county assessor and said, hey, what are these properties worth? Could something like that be substituted in versus us having to go out and?
Oh yeah, I don't think you need to follow this estimation process from Detroit. I mean, I think I think realistically we can just go on BSA and just look up the most recent value that's been inputted by our county assessor.
Okay.
At the worst case scenario, you have last year's estimate of the values, but it's still going to be pretty close. I mean, property values don't fluctuate that much year to year.
Okay. So, I'm sorry, Councilman Burns.
I'd like to share this with you, what I'm seeing in Precinct 1. And if I go off on a tangent, please stop me. I'm seeing 2 new construction companies coming in, buying up property, and doing a nice job of refurbishing the homes. However, the rent is outside the market of that socioeconomic group that's there. It leans toward gentrification to me. However, some homeowners have contacted me and said, I would have liked to purchase that home, Maurice, but nobody told me it was for sale or knew the process. And I'm explaining to them that they have first right to refuse. That's the term that I'm using because it's next door. So how would a resident know that this is in the land bank? Or I got one that's been so vacant, and an outsider wanted to buy the house. So I told a couple of people, hey, you're first, you're second. Get down to City Hall and let them know, you want first right of refusal. How would we, these people know without a sign in the yard? Because I experienced that downtown on Superior a while back. I'm not going to rehash stuff because, let me shut up, but anyway.
No, I think it's a point well taken, and I think one of the things, like the very first section, so this recommendation of surplus property. So we know, obviously, so the quote-unquote urban renewal part of town, we know that's sitting there. But there might be some other properties that the city owns that we don't even know, and just because we're not dealing with that daily. So the the point I'm getting at is, would it be a burden on staff if there was an annual, like, hey, this is the property we have? And to notify the adjacent people.
Well, I think we already, somebody else can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we already basically keep a list
Okay.
of the properties that
Okay.
we may own that are vacant or whatever.
At this point in time, we pretty much know what we have.
Okay.
Both the city and the other, even ABA and such, and EDC.
Okay.
We can pull it up a list. We can also run it off on BSNA under the city to pull up all the properties they own too. And we do have some properties in different areas that are in between residential and or up on the river and such, so.
And anybody can go online and look those up.
Okay.
If they have access to go online.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do agree. I do agree, you know, with Councilmember Barnes, that I think the flow of Detroit's ordinance is helpful because there's an orderly process there, right? So we recommend that, you know, we basically say, hey, we've determined this is surplus property. We estimate the value of it, which is simple. We authorize the sale of it and we get bids. We process the bids. We could reject all bids if we wanted to. So we don't have to take the bids we receive, correct?
You know, I think it depends on how you set this up. I mean, if you, for example, set a minimum bid, I would say anybody that doesn't hit the minimum, you can reject it. But if you set a minimum bid and that's, you know, say $200 and somebody submits, you know, you get 5 bids and only one of them is $200 more. I think you're obligated to accept the highest bid. If you're going to put it up for bid, you would obviously reject those that are lower. I would say you can reject them to the extent that they don't meet the criteria that you set out in the bid requirements. Are they putting in a deposit? Are they meeting the minimum? Things like that.
Because just 1 second, Councilman French, because the one question, what crossed my mind when we were talking about sell a certain property to the adjacent owner, and you mentioned about there could be an oddly shaped lot that you can't build on. Well, what happens, and I think the additional thing is what happens when so in the example we had last time, there's a parcel that obviously could be developed and a house could be put on it. It has not been sold or no one's expressed an interest in it in a long time. The adjacent homeowner says, hey, I just want to kind of cultivate the land and make a really nice, like, mini trail garden thing, right? The property would be put back on the tax rolls, they beautify it, but then someone says, hey, I want to build a house or do something on it. It would seem that the person who's saying, I want to build a house, that's a more kind of compelling thing, but is there anything that within a certain period of time require them to do something that they're telling us they're going to do? And I think that's the other component of it.
So the only way that I could think of that you would do that is you would have to have some sort of buy-sell agreement with the property owner with the caveat that they're buying the property to develop X, Y, and Z on it, and if they don't, then it has to get transferred back to the city.
Would that have to be on the bid, or would that have to be negotiated after the bid?
I mean, you'd probably have to, you would have to put in the bid that you're expecting development on the property.
Okay.
And then, you know, I mean, attach whatever other conditions. I think the thing you have to keep in mind though is, so hypothetically, person A comes in and they say, hey, I'm gonna develop this property and put a house on it. And we do that, you know, we do the bidding process. They are the highest of those bidders to come in and say they wanna build a house. And we transfer the property and they don't build a house. We would then have to take them to court to basically either compel them to comply with that or have the court order the property transferred back to us if they're not compliant. So I mean, it adds an element of makes it somewhat cumbersome. But, I mean, it's not impossible.
Okay. Councilmember French, thank you.
So the other concern that if we start sort of like posting this, how does this prevent someone from the outside to do speculative buying? And then doing, as Councilman Barnes just already indicated, someone coming in and renovating houses in a neighborhood and charging rent that people can't afford, and we get the same gentrification problem that we're talking about. So I would prefer that our system, which we have in place, we just make sure we update our vacant property, and people are interested, come and talk to John or to others about what's available, and then if they express an interest, then we respond. So put the onus on the people who want to buy rather than on us to advertise our vacant property. Because that worries me. That when you think about how long it took for downtown to get under one ownership, or low, we had California residents, not doing anything with buildings downtown, just waiting for the price to go up so they could sell them. That's the same worry that I have here. Is that we're giving someone an opportunity to make money off of our city's impatience with holding property. I can buy a lot, pay $5,000 for it, wait 10 years, put a shed on it, accomplish the building, put something cheap on it, but then still could sell it and make a huge amount of money 10 years from now if we're a better city than we were.
Interim manager.
Well, and I think the city has right of refusal on the sale of a property too. I mean, just because we own it doesn't mean we have to sell it.
Right.
And so
But if we're
someone would have to come in and say, yeah, I'm interested in purchasing property, and then we could decide as a council whether or not we actually want to sell that property or not, for what purposes they want it for.
Yeah, I raised that in the context of what Councilmember Barnes was saying about the adjacent property owners not knowing potentially.
Right, no, I understand that.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about necessarily advertising.
Right, but I'm just extending that to the possibility that if we do advertise for vacant property outside of, so we're talking about different things then?
Yeah, what I was talking about was more of just, if there was a need to update that list, but we're probably not coming into property that often, so.
Every year,
opportunity,
right?
Well, theoretically, yeah, that's true.
Well, the city doesn't get the property, the county normally gets that property.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
For the most part, we have the property that we've had for a period of time. There have been a few times in the past years that we've accumulated some of the property where we tore buildings down and such. Of course, every year the city has the right of first refusal to any of the county treasurer's properties, and basically has to tell them, if you don't want them, you don't want them. But we do have, I know, just so as you think about this, we do have one property in particular. There were two, but I know there's still one that there are more than one person. There's a couple of people that are interested that both live by the property. So they both want the property. One's right next to it, and the other one's across the street. So, and it's a lot that would be, according to both of them, they want it basically for an area to keep green and be able to see across it and not build on it, but it is a buildable lot too. So,
what I'm seeing is like kind of competing things. We want to make sure that we get as much out of it as we can, that someone would reasonably pay for it. But on the other hand, I think you have this thing where you want to respect neighbors' willingness to improve their area, and so just trying to balancing that. I think Detroit's a good place to start, just with the logical flow of the process. But so I guess basically what the attorney has basically placed before us is bid, minimum, and then deposits. The deposit component of it, if you are not the winning bid, is it returned?
I would think so.
Okay.
That's usually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have no problem with deposit. Would there be any objection to a deposit? We could probably have to set the amount or the percentage of the deposit, correct?
Yeah, I mean, Detroit uses 10%.
Okay. So if there's a plot and we're going to sell it for $2,000, you're talking about $200, and that will be included in the purchase.
Yeah,
when
so I
you-
mean, if we're saying, you know, the minimum bid is $2,000, they send in $200 with their offer,
Mhm.
and say that their offer is $3,000,
Mhm.
they only have 2,800 left.
Yeah. So, I mean, and we're not voting or anything, but does anyone see any concern with having a deposit?
Is it refundable?
Yes, I think if you lost the bid. So that seems like an easy one. Is there any, no one's objecting to that. Would anybody object to the 10%?
Could be 20.
We might have to vote on that later on.
Well, and it wouldn't be refundable to the winning bidder on it, because that's the whole point of getting them to pay for the property, not just bidding on stuff they're not gonna buy.
This is just trying to make sure we're dealing with people who are serious about
Right.
making a purchase.
So you're asking how much?
Well, I'm just asking like what percentage, and it's gonna depend on how much, yeah,
10%.
okay. So I don't hear any objections about, having a deposit and having it at 10%. The minimum component. Councilmember French.
I like the language that I think Leslie had, that was, $5,000 lot price unless it's assessed for less. And we already have in our guidelines, if it's a next door neighbor, we're offering it for 200, whatever it was.
We don't do that, the land bank does
Right.
that. Yeah.
One government, another government. So I would suggest that, but that's just the start of the conversation.
So one question I do have, so would the minimum be set every time we want to sell every single property? Or do we have a minimum for acreage, or?
I think you would just establish a minimum, you would assign like a percentage of the fair market value as your minimum,
Okay,
as your minimum bid.
okay.
So I think, you know, on the one hand, you say, you know, do you want to set a value that it needs to exceed to require,
Okay.
you know, like a bid, you know, say, like, for example, Leslie says, you know, okay, we're gonna do an auction style, and in our case, it'd be bidding, you know, if it's fair market value exceeds $5,000. Okay, so let's say, you know, for example, that last scenario that we had, where we had somebody interested in property, one of the lots was like $14,000.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think probably a fair number to it, I mean, and this is for you to decide, maybe say 10% of the assessed value is your minimum bid, or 5% of your assessed value is your minimum, because that way, again, you're gonna get somebody coming in that's gonna do something, wanna commit some money to the property, as opposed to, I'll buy it for $1.
And that's where it comes back to, and that's where I think that's the difficulty. Like I said, I don't want to keep us here all night, but I think we're making good progress. But you know, if someone, so let's say in the case you write, one of those parcels is $14,000. That's the assessed value, and we say, okay, the minimum bid has to be $1,400. Plus, you have to make a $140 deposit for a parcel that no one's shown interest in, but could be, at some point, could be valuable. So like how, basically, like I said, it's weighing like our profit seeking versus just.
I think what I've seen a couple of these municipalities do is they built in a provision where you can waive that requirement based upon criteria. I mean, I know I saw in one or two of these where they basically said, you know, there's good cause, you know, the council can file like a forfeits vote, and I think that was, and that was CBD. I think what they're trying to get at is a supermajority waive that requirement. You know, for example, I think it was in Midland here in the bottom, they say, real property shall be sold or created the same way they do personal property, unless the council by forfeits vote determines it's clearly in the city's advantage to sell property without a competitive bid. So, I mean, you could say something to the effect of, you know, we're gonna assign a minimum a minimum required bid of 10% or 5% of the assessed value, unless by a supermajority vote of the council, if the council determines it's, you know, the city's best interest for that requirement to be waived or something.
Would something as small as putting something back on the tax rolls be in the city's best interest?
You know, it's a.
And that's the thing where. Oh, go ahead.
That's for the council to decide by
Yeah.
vote. I mean, that's,
Yeah. Councilmember French.
I think the problem that we have with 10% is that it's not enough in, you know, yeah, we have one property that's valued $14,000. The rest, I think, are much less. And so, in terms of vacant property. And so, my guess is that, you know, we've got property that's assessed at $3,000 or $4,000. That means someone comes up with $300, and they can own that property. No, I'm not in favor of that at all. I would say 50% as the minimal acceptable bid. And then if it doesn't sell, then we can waive that minimum bid after an auction has failed, if there's been some attempt to receive bids.
So you're,
Councilmember Spicer.
thank you. So, Councilman French, you're saying 50% down?
No. We're talking about minimum bid. So they would then put 10% down of that minimum bid if they win the auction.
Right.
So if something is assessed at $3,000, then the minimum bid would be $1,500. If that's the winning bid, they come up with $150 for a down payment.
To be clear, the way that it's usually done is the deposit accompanies the bid.
Yes.
So you send in your $150 with your bid.
Right. That's what
I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, I think it could lead to, well, I said, what we're trying to do is make sure that we have a uniform process so no one can say the council's just willy-nilly handing out land. If we did 50 though, that would hit that $14,000 property, right? So that's $7,000 minimum bid, $700 for the deposit.
It's a floodplain.
So let's say we do that, but we put it out, but then what you're saying, like, so we put it out, someone doesn't make that bid, then we go to some alternate thing, and we end up right back where we were with the adjacent
Or
homeowner.
we don't sell the property. So I think that's the tension I'm feeling, is that we've got some on council who would like very much to sell vacant property on the short term.
No, I think, I wouldn't attribute it to council. I think we've had instances that pop up that revealed a deficiency in our policy on the issue, and so we're going back to try to fill in the policy vacancy.
So if it's only, I thought I had the floor.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
If it's only about policy, then the percentages become irrelevant. If you're arguing that we are setting policy, that we are uniform, and that's the only reason you're interested in us having this conversation, then the percentage that we put out would be irrelevant. But if the goal is to actually sell property, then the percentages are relevant. So that's all I'm saying, is that if, I think what I'm hearing is that there are members of council that would like us to, and you have said yourself, that you want to increase the tax base, get property onto the tax rolls, so we can start collecting some added tax. And that's a fine, in my opinion, it's a fine agenda to have. But if we sell too much of our vacant property, we might be losing out on opportunities as that value of that property continues to increase. That's all I'm saying. So if we want to make a policy decision, then 50% is a great number. And then if people come forward and they decide, and we write up all the rules and regulations and policy and procedures we have, and then we see what happens. And if nothing happens, then we can go back and look at whether the numbers are useful or not.
Was there a comment? Did you have a comment? Oh, okay.
Mayor, I am asking for privilege.
Okay, that's fine. So the issue is really kind of, like I said, we don't want to, like I was saying earlier, basically there, in both cases, the first time this happened, the person had to buy it at the assessed value because we didn't have the charter changed. The voters changed the charter so that we could sell it for less than the assessed value. There was a resident who wanted to purchase it, and that revealed basically, you know, just the wide openness of the process. So we're trying to put a process together. So even in what you're saying, there's a possibility that if we do that, nobody's interested, but then we've basically had a resident who's been sitting there who would have been interested and would have put it back on the tax rolls. So I think that's still the issue, is how to balance speculator versus resident. And I don't know if we should be making that call, but yeah, I think there is some sense to have some kind of consideration of the resident, you know. Go ahead.
I think we could answer all of this the same. You could do the 50% on the property unless it's adjacent property to somebody's house. Then you could set a specific amount for that if you chose to do that for adjacent property.
Okay.
And then you still leave the 2/3 majority in there as well, so that if you decide you want to do something specific with the property, like a large set of property for a developer, you could set that differently as well.
Okay.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And
Colin,
the
sorry.
section from Detroit, I mean, literally says, when you've got a parcel of real property so limited in size or shape and of such a nature it could only be put to best use by an adjoining owner, you can waive the bid requirement and real property may be sold to the adjoining owner at a price approved by council. So I mean, it kind of gives you an out for those.
But the property that was requested, I guess the last instance, that was usable. That wasn't like an oddly shaped parcel.
Right, and I think, but you mean, and in that case, it's anyone's game. I mean, it's not. You know, the one thing I think that the council should consider, that I know I've had this discussion with staff, and I know the other members of staff are concerned, is, you know, we've had people come to the city asking to buy multiple parcels, and it hasn't come to fruition because of monetary issues, and we're talking about making a bid of $1 plus closing costs, and I think my concern and why I recommend having the minimums are, if somebody can't afford to do closing costs and a transfer fee, they're probably not going to be able to afford to pay the taxes on those parcels in the long run, much less develop the parcels by building a house.
Okay.
And I think that's why a lot of municipalities put these minimums on there, is to make sure that but, I mean, that being said, I'm happy to put together a draft. I mean, this is just, you know, to get some feedback from the council, and I mean, certainly, you know, this isn't coming to for first reading, you know, on Monday or anything, so, I mean, and we can do another discussion on it.
Okay.
I mean, because I've gotten a lot of good feedback tonight.
Yeah.
I mean, and certainly, you know, you can kind of stew on it.
Yeah.
When I bring it back, see what you like, what you don't like. And
Yeah, I think the Detroit model will be a helpful framework going forward. So.
Okay.
Is there any discussion from council? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to public comments. Persons addressing the city comment, we ask that you limit your comments to no more than 3 minutes, and we ask that you observe proper decorum. Is there any public comment this evening? Please come forward and state your name and address.
Good evening, Chris Herwire, 400 East Cass Street. I'm here today mostly to bring up something that I've noticed just over the past several weeks, mostly in the last couple days actually. We're, as you all are probably very well aware due to our media, in the grips of a major campaign throughout the country, but I've been seeing a lot of yard signs for political campaigns within the city limits for interestingly for state senate quite a bit on our main corridors recently, but that's a different thing that I've just found interesting. But I've seen a few regarding city elections, which since we don't hold primaries, all city elections would be held in November, which under our city ordinances, yard signs are allowed for elections only 90 days prior to an election. That I can cite the specific ordinance that falls under. That's in, I have it up here, section 64-7, subsection 7, part A. And given that our city, for city council members, for mayoral elections, I've just happened to notice that there are some yard signs. It's probably due to a lack of knowledge under this specific ordinance for the general population. I didn't notice a specific year on the yard signs. It could be related, it could be people have yard signs from past years and are just unaware of the regulation on this, but I would just like to bring that to the council member and to the general public at large's attention for their knowledge. And I would ask council members if you guys would all pass that information along, because I'm sure there are many members of the city. I didn't know this until relatively recently, that this is a ordinance that we have. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment?
Eric Tobin, 409 West Ash. I've actually put in a request for property. It was basically a road abandonment is what it would be, because it's not a parcel that's on the system as a parcel in the system. It would be a road abandonment, which basically what we did at the county level when I was a road commissioner, is you'd have a public hearing just like you did with the sale of the other property. And then if there was no major objection, then the property would be divided between the two adjacent property owners. So I'm the one property owner in the city as the other property owner, would be the other adjacent property owner. So at the end of Ann Street, right next to the Dalrymple School, is what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I put in a request several years ago. I was told to wait till the charter changed, and so that's happened. So I'm hoping that I still will have the ability to go through that process. And so that might be something also that as you're dividing this policy, that you handle alleyways and those road easements that have been there forever. So that aren't like, I don't know where you'd go with Ann Street. It ends at the end of my parcel. So we're talking 100 feet is why you would expand the road if you did put it in there. So the city mows it, and I'm willing to put it back on the tax rolls. So as an adjacent property owner.
Thank you. Jay, did you? Yeah, absolutely.
Jay Loomis, 408 West Ash Street. I find it interesting that when I moved into Albion 20 years ago, Mrs. Face never asked me why I was buying her house. She really didn't care so long as I bought it. I also know that your employer, Professor, is actively, maybe not so much this year, but actively has been, am I all right? Am I still with you?
Just address me.
Okay, I'm sorry. Has actively been purchasing properties in their corridor, although I don't exactly understand what their corridor is, because it seems to get larger. But either way, generally speaking, nobody that I know of that sold them properties has asked them why they're buying them, just that they're buying them and they're happy to sell them. It's curious to me that in these properties, if I recall a previous council meeting, the city spends or is at a loss of about $20,000 a year. So the one entity I would think that would be completely against us selling any property would be Hawkins Mowing. They make about 55 grand off of us a year, and granted we get about 25 to 30 of that back, but we still operate at a loss. Anybody that buys it, if they buy a land big enough to sell or big enough to build on, you would think that in time the market would mean if Albion is on the rise, that somebody else would come in and say, I'd be willing to buy that from you to build a house. And I don't know, if I was the one that owned it, I'd think, I could make some money on it. I don't think that's a loss on the city if it turns over and another person buys, because you would have not had to pay somebody to have it mowed in that period of time. Just a thought from my end. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further,
Terry Adkins, 1,000.
can you repeat it just for the mic?
Pardon?
Can you repeat your information for the mic?
Okay. Terry Adkins, 178020, 27 Mile Road. I'm a 35-year landlord in Albion, and I'd like to get a little clarification. First of all, do you really want to put in a rental certification to take care of what John says is approximately 45 calls a year for code enforcement? And also, he quoted sanitary conditions and electrical conditions and stuff like that. Sanitary conditions are not a landlord problem. 99% of the time, it's tenant problems. It's not a landlord, so we should not be charged to take care of that. And the annual registration, so we pay every year, and then we pay the off years for the inspections. And then as far as he was saying that when they go out on a code enforcement call, that's a cost to the city. But the city is already paying for his wages and the people that they're, it's in the budget, it's not a extra cost. So if they would just go ahead and do the inspections that they're called for, and then in their spare time, if they see something that he's out with his camera, I'm not being mean to John, I'm just saying that I've been doing this for 35 years. So he knows what's bad, what's not bad, that kind of thing. And then another thing, in the proposal, if you've got a 40-unit apartment house and you pay $25 registration, but if you've got 40 individual houses, you're going to pay that times 40. That's not even close to being fair. And I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I'll let that go. But just one more thing. The transfer of property. If one of the council members owns property and they sell it, they do not have to have the buyer sign an affidavit saying that they're going to accept any code violations and take care of any code. But if I buy it, then I have to do that. If I sell my property, if I sell it as a rental property, I still have to do that. I have to either fix it or have them do it. It's a two-tier system, which is not what we're supposed to be doing.
Thank you, sir. Is there any further public comment this evening?
Brian Mull, 24772 J Drive South, Homer, Michigan. I'll start out, John and I have had many conversations, and I respect John, and I know that his goal is to make Albion a better place, and that is mine. So I just want to touch on a few issues that I see. But I would like to address Mr. Harkness first. He made the comment in here earlier that no one had attempted to have the tenants responsible for the water bills. I have brought Mr. Mead a copy of all my leases that is applicable. Mr. Harkness has actually reviewed those and refused to accept them as acceptable to the city and meeting the code. So when he made the statement that nobody's tried, I'm a little confused about that. My attorney has actually got involved in this. So we have actually tried to hold the city of Albion accountable to the 1933 Tax Revenue Bond Act, which we've not been able to do to this point. The city's refused. But anyway, moving on to the rental ordinance. The cost, Mr. French is like $54. That may be what you charge, but the city of Jackson charges $206 an hour for their inspectors. So figure out what it's going to cost, and that's going to get passed on to all of my tenants. I'm not against safety, as John points out, but as Terry just said, if you're worried about, water heaters and that, I'm not against that, but why is it that we want to treat rentals different than owner-occupied? If you're saying, in effect, We don't care if an owner-occupied person dies in their house because of carbon monoxide, but the rental we do. That just seems a little duplicitous to me. I mean, I'm in favor of it, and I've told John this. If you want to do every house across the board, you'll have my 100% respect and cooperation. But I find it unfair that you will take one house as rental and hold it to one standard, and then owner-occupied next door, we totally leave alone. The other hypocrisy is this building right here would not pass the code that John wants us to be held to. No way, no how. So why is it that the city won't take care of this building that we're sitting in, but you want to hold me to a standard higher than what you yourselves will apply and abide by? I think that's wrong and hypocritical. It's not fair, and like the enforcement, we've pointed out to several of the council members, we're not enforcing the ordinances that we have, so why are we going to put more on people and whether they're enforced or enforced selectively? I've asked that question before, and I don't have an answer. And another thing is John brought up, and I like the idea, I like what John's trying to do, like the tenants, there's junk, there's couches and things on there. John's pointed out and just said in here that you would hold the tenants accountable. You're going to have a copy of every landlord's lease so you know who that person is, how are you going to enforce it, and what are you going to do to them, and who's going to protect that personal information, because you're going to have all their private information.
Sir, thank you. 303, okay. Is there any further public comment this evening? Okay, seeing that, I'm going to allow Dr. Tracy to speak, and I have two things, just updates.
Just real quick, if you reviewed the tapes earlier, I did say we go across the board with our houses, and we've had houses we've taken down that were privately owned, so we do go across the board with them.
Okay. Thank you. Just two things. One, I just want to thank again the subcommittee the council authorized for the rules. We had a good session.
You got the second copy, right?
Yes. Okay, we had a good session last Thursday to incorporate the recommendations from Attorney Smith. So we're going to have him review it this week, and hopefully we can have a first approval approval at the next meeting. Go ahead, Councilmember French.
Thank you, Mayor. There was a section, this is a question for you, there was a section that I had highlighted in red.
Mm-hmm.
It was because Councilman Brown and you and I were in disagreement as to whether
Okay.
it should be included or not.
Okay.
So if you, in your comment to the attorney,
Okay.
could you just ask him his opinion on whether
Exactly.
or not, because it may be a little redundant
Okay.
on reflection, but I just wanted to make
Okay.
sure that that's highlighted.
Okay,
So,
thank you. And then the other comment is it's a good teachable moment about, I guess, the structure of government in our country and how legislative bodies work with the judicial branch, and how, the city is not only accountable to, I guess, for federal laws, but, state laws, state statute, charter, council rules, ordinance, and resolutions. Those are all open to judicial review. And so the Supreme Court actually struck down language like that. I'll have Attorney Harkin to speak to that.
Every municipal sign ordinance in the United States.
In 2015.
Reed versus Town of Gilbert, Arizona. It was a 2014 U.S. Supreme Court case that struck down every municipal sign ordinance that regulates signs based on content.
Yeah.
We can only regulate based upon size, shape, color,
Visibility.
lighting, visibility, things of that. So we no longer regulate political signs based, placing them certain times of year, things like that.
Because the case had to do, I believe, with like a religious...
Political signs.
Yeah, political signs versus putting up a yard sign for a church service or something. The government can't make distinctions about kinds of speech, correct?
Yeah, you can't.
Okay.
The plainest way to say it is you can't regulate based on content.
So a lot of times I think happens like there are state statutes, but if the court strikes certain things down, they become inoperable. They're on the books, but they're not the law. And so it actually goes back to a big part of last fall when I was looking at some of the charter updates. That would include kind of code updates, because there's certain things that are on the books that the courts have rendered inoperable. So Yes, Oscar.
I'd just like to remind people, when it comes to putting these signs in your
placement.
yards, that the placement of them between the curb and the sidewalk is illegal still, and they need to be placed from the sidewalk towards the house. I've seen several in town already that are in the city right-of-ways, and our new code enforcement officer will probably be out there shortly removing them.
The state Senate candidate. Councilmember Spicer.
Well, Mayor, I was just going to have you summarize basically what you said. You're kind of mumbling and
So,
just so people know.
So basically, the state can pass laws, we can pass ordinances, resolutions, but those are always open to judicial review. In this case, and with the Supreme Court, Gilbert versus Reed versus City of or Town of Gilbert, something like that.
We'll just call it the Reed.
Yeah, the Reed case in 2015, and they basically said we can't have you can't have a situation where you're saying, okay, if it's a political message, you can only have it up 90 days before the election, but if you're having a vacation Bible school and you put this equally sized sign up somewhere, you can keep that up for months. You know, so it's a kind of First Amendment thing. So.
A rule that says only 90 days.
2015.
Okay.
Well, they didn't just do it.
Well, it's been going for a while. Yeah. Okay, Councilmember Reed.
With city cleanup coming up, can someone please let me and other people know where you can take paint cans or electronics, things like that before the cleanup?
We'll try to give an update on that Monday.
Okay.
Okay, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Is there support?
Support.
All those in favor say yes?
Yes.
Yes. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.